Right, good morning, Year 13. We're here to talk about a song, Absent from Thee. As ever, I want to start with the context. John Wilmot was a very famous poet, and as I told you earlier, he's famous for his licentious content. He wrote a great deal about sex. Now, in terms of history, what's interesting for you to know, look at these dates here, 1647 to 1680. Short, wild life. And you could say that John Wilmot characterized the age. He was the zeitgeist of the Restoration. So the Restoration happens in 1660. Why do you need to know that? Well, from 1642 to 1660, England was ruled by the Puritans and by, in particular, Oliver Cromwell. And this was a very strict and puritanical time. They closed down the bars, the village halls, they even banned things like skittles and dancing, etc. So as you know, the Puritans tended to be a lot stricter in their interpretations of religion, etc. But it was also a very important age for you to know about, because although the Puritans are usually given a very bad press, it was an explosion of ideas at the time. Because government censorship broke down, there were lots of competing and conflicting ideas that came out. And many different religious movements, like the Diggers, the Quakers, the Levellers. So in some respects, it was a very intellectual age. In 1660, you have the Restoration, and that's when King Charles I had his head cut off, as many of you know. And then his son returned from France, King Charles II. And when he came back, it was a bit like the Great Gatsby. It was party time. Basically, they got rid of all of the Puritan rituals and things. They dug up Oliver Cromwell's body. Listen to this, because this is incredible. And all that was left was his skeleton. And they hung at his skeleton from the scaffold, symbolically to say, stuff you Puritans, your era is gone. And then what started was this party time, as I said, okay? So the Restoration is known as naughty times. And why it's very interesting to link this to Gatsby would be to say, think about women's dress. Because obviously we know the flappers were going around and they had short dresses and they were more androgynous and they had more athletic wear, etc. One of the key things that happens in England in 1660 as women appear on the stage for the first time. I want you to think about that for a moment. One extraordinary difference when you go and watch a female part in Shakespeare before the Restoration, it was a little boy playing it, wasn't it? A beardless man would have played the part. All of a sudden, you have a real live woman on the stage. Now, to many, this was symbolic of the corruption of the times, because a woman being seen in this public way, parading herself on the stage, was often likened to kind of prostitution. So from the Puritan perspective, these times were the times of absolute moral turpitude and corruption. And in the theatre, very often they did cross-dressing. So it was a very common trope, would be the woman who dresses as a man to do something, like, to get her money back or something like that. That offered the opportunity on the stage for a woman to wear trousers. And I want you to think that, which means that you could then discern the shape of her body. So, in today's terms, this would be seen as sexually shocking. And the theatre became a kind of centre of a court culture based around that cavalier idea of carpe diem, which we see in a lot of our poems. Now, I think it's interesting, don't you think, to just pause and to think about how we could compare that to Gatsby. Now, Tom's very conservative view of society, do you remember where he condemns women who jauntily go around? Gallivanting is the term that he uses, isn't it? And he kind of implicitly condemns Jordan, doesn't he? I think you can see lots of parallels between those two ages. So it's possible, remember students, to make comparisons between context in your essays, as well as between things like character, theme, motifs, and symbolism. So Rochester, as I said, of all of the Restoration poets, was the most notorious. He wrote a lot about genitals, sexuality, homosexuality, you name it. And he was considered incredibly naughty and corrupt and licentious. But this poem is very different from that. And in many ways, it's seen as a far more kind of romantic idea of love. However, I find it quite a confusing poem, because in some ways it seems to be about the worship of women and about the importance of things like fidelity and how a woman, it actually does link to Shakespeare's sonnet, doesn't it? A woman is a kind of your North Star that orientates your life. But in other ways, I think we could actually suggest that there are parallels between this poem and the Scrutiny, and the idea that wandering or straying is the natural way for men to be, which is what the commander says, doesn't he, in The Handmaid's Tale, where he says it's nature, when he talks about the need that men have, apparently, for variety, when he's in Jezebel's. Do you remember that? He says that it's natural. So that's an element of patriarchal discourse, isn't it? That men are genetically encoded to have sexual conquest with a variety of people, whereas conversely, women are seen as faithful and needing to stay pure. So I'm sure we'll all feel as though that's a little bit unjust, that double standard. Absent from thee I languish still, then ask me not why I return. Now we said earlier, didn't we, it's very interesting he uses the term languish, which I think we could agree is quite a feminine term. It means that he's waiting, that she is the agent, and he is passive at this particular point. You'll notice the poem begins with absent. And that's quite interesting in itself, isn't it? Because here, he lacks her. He is the person waiting. And it links to this idea of languishing. Then ask me not when I return. This straying fool will plainly kill. Now, what I'm curious about here is he saying that he is the straying fool? If he is, then what he's sort of suggesting is that he, like Tom, is on a little bit of a spree, as Tom would call it, wouldn't he? And it seems to me a very close argument to Tom's argument, which is that my little sexual spree, my little sexual sojourn, is of no value or consequence. I'm still faithful to thee in my own way. So I'm sure you're all thinking now, that sounds very like non-sum, doesn't it? So a familiar motif for us at love poetry is the idea, once again, that male straying, male conquest, is of no import if it is simply sexual. But it's not clear if he's talking about another fool or himself. 'Twill plainly kill to wish all day, all night to mourn. So is he saying, I can't just wait feeling pain? This is not necessary. Now, if we think about the poem that we did yesterday, Remember, by Christina Rossetti, this seems to fit in with the idea, doesn't it? That a man cannot fill his mind with thoughts of the woman, that this is not right, that this is, too much sacrifice, etc. Christina Rossetti, in the sestet of the sonnet, do you remember, actually says, you don't need to remember me. I don't want you to be sad. And that seems to be a similar idea here to the speaker in Wilmot's poem. Now you'll notice the break for the I am again. Dear. This intimate word, it's italicized. It's a direct address to the person that he's speaking to, which is so often the case in our love poetry, isn't it? Whether we're looking at the flea, etc. It's a man speaking to a woman in an intimate way, persuading, manipulating, etc. And as we've said many times, the woman is voiceless. She's not there able to speak back to us. Dear, from thy arms then let me fly. Well, that's familiar, isn't it? Let me have variety. Let me go out into the world. Let me have some of these beautiful women who exist in, as we've seen in the scrutiny, with many different hair colors, etc. That my fantastic mind, now that's really interesting, isn't it? Today, by fantastic, we would mean my mind is amazing. Here, I think there's more of a meaning of fantasy. But once again, is it the case that what he's saying then is that his mind, his male mind, is always wandering to the next fantasy? May prove the torments it deserves to try. Now, this is really interesting because torments obviously refers to the torments of hell. And it seems to me the conceit here is something like this. He's saying, I have to go out and find about all these torments and hellish things. I have to try them. Because then I will know your value even more. Once again, doesn't that sound like Tom, whose sprees are inconsequential because he always comes back to his northern star, Daisy, that tears my fixed heart from my love. So again, he's saying that he's fixed. So in some ways, I'm going to suggest to you, he's pretending to be like Shakespeare's speaker, isn't he? He's pretending to say, my heart is fixed. Now that term, goes back to the idea of navigation in the stars, isn't it? Your fixed point. It's a thing that cannot move. It's the idea of the first cause. Godlike. It can't be tested. But is his heart fixed? I would suggest not. I would suggest once again that that's more of a rhetorical strategy within love poems. Then wearied, listen to all the W's, world of woe. So after all of the sexual adventure, etc., whatever may occur, he'll be worn out, tired, and need his Saviour woman again. He'll return to thy safe bosom. Again, safe is often used in navigation, isn't it? Like a safe port. To thy safe bosom I retire, where love and peace and truth does flow. So this is his incredible kind of moral point. And we've spoken a lot, haven't we, about how women in literature are often encoded as kind of moral beings that can anchor men in the journey of life, which is dangerous, etc. May I contented there expire. Now, I don't want to go too much into this, but I think we can see this flow idea, and breast almost seems like a kind of maternal breast milk idea. And also, it doesn't seem to me quite as innocent as it might appear at first glance. One, this image here is actually highly sexualized, isn't it? The flowing bosom. And this one here, may I contented there expire. Now, one of the key ideas in Elizabethan poetry, restoration poetry, metaphysical poetry, will be the idea of dying and expiring as meaning having an orgasm. So it can be read in that way. And it's often used as a code by men. And it comes from the French, like the idea of the la petite mort, the idea that sexuality is like the little death, like a small death. So is he suggesting there that he will then be able to, again, resume his sexual life with her? Well, that would be one possible reading of it. And I guess, once again, that seems to me to link very much with Tom, the idea that he will breed with Daisy. That's the woman he breeds with. But in the meantime, he'll have a kind of sexual adventures with quite a few women. Less wants, more wandering from that heaven. And here we have the idea of the angel woman, don't we? Which we see so often in our literature, in The Handmaid's Tale with Serena Joy. I think we see it in A Streetcar Named Desire, in the way that Blanche wants to be, spotless, pure, etc. She's aware of this archetype, isn't she, in A Streetcar Named Desire? And she's aware how far she is from it. And that's part of the thing that's killing her. It's that craving for purity and a sense of vile corruption all around her. I fall upon some base heart unblessed. Well, would you say that this is our Myrtle? What do you think? That it's our Myrtle, the base heart. In Myrtle's case, it would be the base body, wouldn't it? With its surplus flesh, its big breasts, it's everything that Daisy's not. Daisy's very kind of ethereal, isn't she? She's blonde and ethereal. She's the fae, she's the fairy, she's dematerialized. And Myrtle is this kind of flesh creature that takes you into the land of temptation, hellish in many ways. You'll notice that men displace responsibility for their sexuality onto women, onto temptresses, femme fatales, and they often represent themselves as being destroyed by these women. Not their own proclivities, not their own agency and decisions, but rather that it's the women who've done this to them. And now we have all our fricatives, don't we? Faithless to thee, false. Look at the thesaurus as they pile, the line piles up, unforgiving. And it really adds emphasis to this idea that once again, he seems to picture himself as a kind of victim. And I would suggest there's quite a lot of self-pity in that line. And lose my everlasting rest. So he fears not going to heaven. And again, the conceit is her body and heaven. Because she is seen as the true woman, the woman that he should return to. So I think this poem, in that sense, is very useful in terms of thinking about Tom and Daisy's relationship in The Great Gatsby. I see a lot of parallels between this idea of the woman that you return to, the woman that you have a spree with. How do you divide women into these two categories of these two very distinct classes? Now, of course, this would contrast very much with Gatsby's idea. And Gatsby, as we've said before, seems to link a great deal more to Sonnet 116, doesn't it? Yeah? Because in Gatsby's case, it is everlasting. I think this poem, on the other hand, links a lot more to non-sum and to this idea of men redefining fidelity so that it allows for sexual adventure and sexual diversity. And there's a kind of pseudo idea of fidelity, isn't there? You know, I'm faithful in my heart. Now, in particular, what's interesting, we've talked a lot about this from a feminist perspective, is how often this idea of sexual double standards comes in. Because, again, in Great Gatsby, with Tom, we know that he's horrified by female sexual adventure and the idea of female freedom. He sees that as corrupt, as base, as destroying society, almost as bad as colored people, as he calls them, corrupting Western society as well. I think key thing to remember is the kind of falseness of that conservatism. What Fitzgerald is trying to show us is the hypocrisy of those positions. I hope that was useful.